Well, this is an example of the COWCH program of the Wildlife Society. And this is a program that was established in 1999. And it's the whole idea, COWCH is an acronym for Celebrating Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage. And basically the big idea is to capture oral history interviews of people that have been involved with the wildlife profession in one capacity or another. And the whole series of tapes that have been done include former students of all Leopold and that group, and generally people that have logged some years and experience sharing their stories, and some of them are quite different from others. But so I'm Dan Svedarsky, and my interviewer is Terry Wolfe, and I think we'll just launch into the program.
Well, Dan, I've heard a lot of rumors over the years, you know, on your birth, but maybe you could review just where you were born and a little bit about your early upbringing.
Well, there was a birth, and it happened in Pueblo, Colorado in 1944. And my parents then moved briefly to Cleveland, Ohio, and then I think were on their way to Alabama. They had heard of some cheap land down there, and they ran out of gas coupons in the Ozarks. And an old trapper by the name of Charlie Ganley saw a tricycle tied to the front of their car, which belonged to my brother. He saw the out-of-state plates and the tricycle, and he thinks, out-of-state people, got some kids, might be interested in some land. So my dad did buy some land, and within 2 weeks he had a milk check. Started out with a piece of scrub oaks, built some stanchions, bought a few dairy cows, and that's how we got started. That was in West Plains, Missouri, where I grew up. I think I was 3 or 4 at that time. Grew up, went to high school there at West Plains. And we started out with that dairy farm, as I outlined, and we logged in the oak woods for a little supplemental income, and it was a kind of a hard scrabble existence, but learned a lot. And one of the things that I remember vividly was how hard black walnut was to drive nails through. Because we built hog houses out of black walnut, because we had a lot of it.
So you have a brother too.
I have a brother. He's 5 years older than I, and is a plumber in Seattle.
In Seattle, yeah. So you graduated from high school in West Plains?
From West Plains, and then
quit education after that, or did you keep going?
Well, no, I then went to Chicago because my mother, who grew up in Georgia, my father, his parents had come from Russia, so he had grown up in Colorado. But my mother had a lot of brothers and sisters in the Chicago area. So right after I graduated from high school, I went and worked at a factory, actually the first summer. And then my buddies, none of my parents had gone to college, so I was a first generation college student. My buddies were going off here and there to college, and I decided to go to Arkansas State, at Jonesboro. So I started there. That was only 100 miles from our home farm. I started there, and went 1 year, and I started. You were talking earlier, Ross, about the advice and the guidance of a guidance counselor. I think mine's name was Olson too. But when I mentioned wildlife, there's no jobs in wildlife and so on. So, well, I figured he knew what he was talking about. So somehow or another, I grew up without TV, had no idea what a lawyer did. But boy, it impressed the folks back home when I said I was majoring in pre-law and business administration. So that was my first major.
Kept sending money that way. That was good.
And then I happened to take a course in general biology, and things clicked, or general botany. Things clicked in that course. and bragging just a little bit because I wasn't a star student, but I did make the first 100% on the botany final that this professor had ever had made. So then he called me into his office, and I thought I was in trouble. And he said, what are you majoring in? A little bit stern-like. And I said, well, you know, I'm not really quite sure. He said, well, have you ever thought about medicine? Well, I had never been sick, so he's talking, you know, pre-med or something like that. And then he said, well, you know, I've never had a person get 100% on my botany final. You were the first. And said, that's pretty remarkable. You did good. So then, but I was just barely scraping by, trying to put myself through college, and so I stayed out of college for a couple of years. I went back to Chicago, worked on construction as a cement finisher, and saved up some money, and then went back to University of Missouri at Columbia, and then wound up getting tangled up with this my wife Vicki, and that was a wonderful thing. And in that course, so long as I'm talking about education kind of things, in that course of events, I think I had a total of about 8 different majors altogether.
Over your college career.
Over my college career, yeah.
Man.
But I had a lot of interest, and but to fast forward a little bit, and she was a couple years behind me in college, so we needed to stay there for her to finish up, and so I stayed. I got a master's in plant ecology with a minor in wildlife. And then we came here in '69 to University of Minnesota-Crookston. It was called the Technical Institute then, and it was a 2-year program. And
I think to outsiders, I don't know if we call it that from within town.
Well, it's probably called the Ag School, or later became called the Tech, but Ag School first.
Yeah.
And then later took a half-time leave and then did my doctorate at the University of Minnesota working on prairie chickens with Seablum as my advisor, Bob Seablum.
Oh, you and Vicki meet?
Well, along, I don't know, year 3 or so in college, I had such a hodgepodge of classes. Everything from pre-contract to pre-law, business administration, wildlife, pre-veterinary medicine, blah, 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 that I figured out that, because I was really serious about this lady, I figured out that I need to get practical. I figured out how to count that hodgepodge of courses towards something, and it turned out to be biology education with a minor in human physiology, because I was a major.
Human physiology.
Yeah, that's my minor, with a major in biology education. So, she also being an education major, we had a class called History of American Education. Not a real stimulating class, but she needed a lot of help. So we had study dates.
Just kept on studying pretty good. Then, after the studies, then eventually marriage, and then started a family here, huh? So
Yeah. We came with one child. He was, that would have been Alex. He would have been about a year and a half, something like that.
Oh.
And then later added Andy, 5 years later, and then 7 years after that added Amanda. So we had 3 children.
So how are they doing these days?
Well, Alex runs he's a personal trainer and runs a fitness center in Costa Rica, San Jose. Son Andy lives in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and is a international business guy, and is also raises chickens, golden and plump, but he's in the process of trying to sell that operation now. 2 jobs are getting old, especially when you have to travel to Africa and things like that. And then our daughter works for Prime Therapeutics in healthcare systems and lives in Laconia.
It seems like Amanda has moved around a bit over the last year.
Yeah, she has worked for Wells Fargo for a number of years.
So let's see, grandkids, you have?
We have 5, or 8 actually, 3 in Costa Rica, 3 in Laconia, and then 2 in Wisconsin.
Your wife chortling there in the background, or wondering how you gained 3 there over the 5, but I guess as long as
Yeah.
you've got the math, it should be okay.
Well, that was one of my challenges in college was math.
So botany.
Engineering, I was also in engineering for a semester. And the math kicked my butt, and so, yeah.
Probably you and I worked somewhat together on that, you know, or why would you go to a counselor, you know, when you can just daddle around here and there and learn do hard knocks or just.
Well, again, didn't have my parents to rely on because neither of them had gone to college.
Yeah.
My dad was well read, though. So, but he was a wise man, and well read, but didn't have the formal education, didn't know the systems.
You know, I knew a bit of your dad, and as he lived in East Grand Forks through a flood and whatever, but he, so what dates did you, he was a bit of an engineer too, I would have to say, or?
Well, an entrepreneur, a tinkerer, and an inventor, a risk taker. Always was thinking about new ideas and thoughts, and had a lot of energy. Like people.
The risk taker, I think, was when he remodeled his motel, his apartment in Grand Forks, you know,
Yeah.
I would think the owner of that place would have pondered that a little bit, with a table saw in there and various other equipment, but.
Sawdust about 3 inches deep, and with a wheelchair with crippled up hands. So he was quite a force. Even when he was partially paralyzed in a wheelchair, he was still quite a force.
So then you came to Crookston, and what happened after that?
Well, we came to
Your
Crookston,
PhD, yeah,
and
had some time.
well, after about 4 years, I still wasn't as competent. Well, when we first came, the first summer, we didn't have anything specifically lined up. And I didn't know enough about Minnesota conditions as far as wildlife and natural resources, because I really wanted to. So we went to Itasca. So we loaded up our little car at the time and our kid and our bicycle, and I took 4 courses at the Itasca Biological Station, which you did, and you know what a wonderful place that was. And one of my key mentors there was Bill Marshall. That was his last summer as the director of the biological station. So, you know, one thing can lead to another if you're looking for opportunities, and that was a really key one. Met Seablum there. In fact, that's where Bob Seablum later would become my advisor. That's where he met his wife that summer too, Vicki.
So you started out at Crookston as an instructor, or?
Yeah, as an instructor with a master's degree, and then you know, four summer classes at Itasca, which was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
I don't know you start out as an instructor, and where do you go?
It goes instructor, and then assistant professor, and then associate professor, and then professor. I think I was the second full professor on the campus. Could have been the first, but I just didn't get around doing the paperwork. And there is quite a bit of paperwork to do.
Well, you're all right, but then were you always 50% time at the?
Not always. When I was national president of the Wildlife Society, I asked Larry Smith if I could increase my percentage of time with the research center, because I think I hit about 15 different states in the country as I was national president going around. But generally speaking, it was started out as 25-75, and then 50-50, and then 75-25. So it is varied. I've in the 49 years that I was actively employed, I probably had more diverse appointments than any other faculty member.
Well, I always thought that was a good combination with the research.
It really was. And as part of that, well, it all started with the formation of the Red River Valley Natural History Area. And Marshall, who you were talking about earlier, Bill Marshall, he was head of, out of Itasca, but Cedar Creek. So he was a valuable source of guidance in how to set up a natural history area. So he had his fingers in that, and they flew a plane of guys up, including Frank Coffert, who was the Dean of Forestry, Alexander Hodson of Hodson Hall, Scotty Scholten, who was an extension forester, Bill Miles, who was an extension forester and was very active in setting up the State Environmental Education Board, and then Bill Marshall. So it was, as I think back on it, boy, it was quite a group of heavy hitters in the Natural Resources Administration stuff on that.
They all came out to see a sheep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Were they impressed with that, or were they impressed with the idea of what could be done with that?
Well, again, thanks to Bill Marshall's visionary capabilities and his ability to influence people in his quiet yet effective way, he was key. And then later, when I decided to look into a doctoral program, he had valuable advice too. I could have gone to St. Paul part-time or whatever and had him as my advisor. But he said, you've got to think about your family and be practical. And boy, that was great advice. That was so much more important than just being able to point to who your advisor was. So
let's see, Bob Seaboom, and who else was?
Lou Oring, who was the behavioral ornithologist at the time, and a chemist, and then a geology prof. So I wound up getting a master's, or a minor as part of my doctorate in geology.
Oh, you did, huh?
So I'm kind of a generalist, well, very much of a generalist by interest.
Good way to be. Yeah. Well, I guess even these days there's some pondering over just how the little classroom landed out there, I guess, and the lack of paperwork is a comment I heard.
Well, the little classroom.
Maybe just talk about how
we
what
call
that
it
is.
The Nature Center. There was some discussion as to what to do with the old garage that used to be used by the superintendent of the Northwest School and the experiment station. So I got a hold of a tractor and some skids, and we skidded across the frozen ground in the wintertime.
So that's from the little house, or the house that's near the natural history area there?
Right, that was a two-car garage. And I replaced the double doors with some help from the farm crew. Replaced the double doors with three windows that I talked a local contractor out of. And we put a door where a couple windows used to be. And then we later added a little storage shed. And then more recently added a well. And it was furnished about 5 o'clock one morning as they had accumulated a lot of surplus property for a sale of chairs and desks and so on. So I made 3 quick trips out there with a pickup and trailer. And so it got furnished all before 7 o'clock. And there were some people that showed up for the sale. Geez, I was going to look for that desk that was here yesterday. What's happened,
Well, that's quite a nice addition, I'd have to say, out there. Well, we should go a little further in the natural history area. So you have a lot of trails out there. There's been a lot of research projects there too that have been kind of interesting over the years, I would say.
Well, in '71, we started a little demonstration experiment looking at the role of fire in controlling aspen sucker shoots and stimulating the prairie grasses that were still hanging on, but they were being smothered out by the Kentucky bluegrass. So we started burning in the spring, and when the Kentucky bluegrass started actually growing, which suppressed the Kentucky bluegrass, but it stimulated the warm season grasses. And I was pleased to hear years later, Karen Smith pointed to some of that early work that we did there as kind of a guide for some of her work at Lost Wood National Wildlife Refuge when she was the director there. And then another thing that came along fortuitously is I had a student named Norman Pankratz in 1969 and 70. We were a two-year institution then, and only had him for a couple classes. He was later killed in an accident, and when he went into the service, he had to take out a life insurance policy. And he did that, and he told his folks, well, what should we do with this money? Anything should happen to you. Well, he said, I'd like to go to conservation. He said, well, we see. Well, just talk to Svedarsky at UMC, and you know what to do with it. Well, unfortunately, I got a call, and he had been killed, and I got a call from his parents. He loved to hop freight trains, and he apparently got tangled up in a freight train and was killed. But so with some of those funds, we used to develop a new improved roadway going into the natural history area. We bought an additional 15 acres of land south of the railroad tracks. We bought the Pankratz Prairie, the first quarter section, right across the road here. And then you later put me on to Carolyn Keeler, who, for the Keeler tract, that was the second quarter. But that Pankratz Prairie tract is now, over a section. And then an additional 5,000 was used to set up as a little endowment for the Pankratz Conservation Award, which is the highest award given by the department. So again, these things kind of dovetail together, and you know, you never know just what thing is going to benefit what thing, and so.
Well, you did a little bit of work out there, I think, too, which got you into gravel pits.
Well, that was Bill Marshall's idea, because a good portion of, probably a third of it, is a worked out gravel pit. Gravel for the first streets of Crookston came from there, because the people who could afford cars were getting tired of getting stuck in the mud downtown. So they financed, the automobile club financed graveling of the streets in downtown Crookston, but they would bring it in with horses. So, but Bill Marshall saw that and said, you know, there's a lot of these gravel pits scattered around the state. So one use for this could be as a demonstration area for the use of worked out gravel pits. That then led to later to an international symposium on wildlife values of gravel pits, which we had Gus Swanson, and who was an Aldo Leopold Award winner, and another gentleman from out east who had worked with gravel pit stuff. But they were here as our featured speakers. We were probably at that conference. We had three people from England.
Yeah, the international
over here. But again, if you just, you know, kind of keep thinking about ways to leverage things, and especially when you get stimulated by the likes of Bill Marshall, that, you know, or they just see the possibilities in different things, and good things can happen.
Well, we did, working with Natural Resources Department, did follow some of your advice there, I guess, on gravel pit restoration on the Pembroke Wildlife.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We dug out some ponds there and various things to level things off. Yeah, so there, I'm sure others used ideas from that also, you know. And
well, Richard Crawford, now retired prof from UND, of course, co-edited the symposium proceedings. And then we did one for the state in conjunction with DNR and the Department of Transportation. That led to a little publication guidance too. So it's been a fun ride.
I guess your dissertation, PhD wise, was yeah, kind of a. Well, we should discuss that a little bit, and because there were memorable events, I guess, in your field work with, as I recall, there was a bright yellow vehicle that gained some renown around town and other places, but.
Well, this was an international scout, and the story of how the scout came into existence was I try to piece together and find resources wherever. And so I took Leonard Rydell and his wife out to watch prairie chickens. And then I asked Leonard, do you maybe have any kind of a four-wheel drive vehicle that I might be able to use to study prairie chickens? Well, he sold that international scout to me for 3 years for $1.
He did.
At the end of which I sold it back to him for $1. So the price was right. I then put an antenna on the top of it to keep up with prairie chickens. And the antenna turned out to be 12 foot 5 inches tall. And we put radio receivers on airplane struts to find lost birds more easily. And so I went out to equip an airplane one night, not knowing that the main power supply going into the airport was about a foot higher, lower than my antenna. So there was this big bang, and everything got dark in the whole airport. And I didn't know what it was. So I get out of the vehicle, and it was kind of a close one, because the electric wire was draped over the car, the vehicle. So at any rate, there were 2 planes on the approach system to land at that time when everything went dark, runway lights, the whole work. So they had to be rerouted to Thief River and Grand Forks. So I got to meet several people. As a result of that.
It's kind of a pattern, you know,
Yeah.
various other things.
But yeah, that's one of the stories that involve the yellow machine. And I had a discussion with a highway patrolman at one time too about coming to a rolling stop, and he had to have been at least 2 miles away. But he swore up and down that it was a rolling stop rather than a complete stop, and he may have been right. But,
It was a pretty busy intersection though.
Yeah, right, it was at Herald Station.
Yeah. About 3 cars an hour go by there, so, man. I'm gonna be watching. But, well, let's see there. Along with your research, well, that involved, you should talk a little bit about the field work, I guess, involved in. There was a Georgia Jack in there.
When the field work started, it was the 1st of April for 3 years. And we were living in town then, and I would have to get up and be out in the blind to trap chickens when it was still dark. Meanwhile, I was teaching courses at UMC, taking graduate courses at UND. So I would come back through town, quick shower, teach a class or 2 at UMC, barrel over to UND to take some graduate classes. But the good news was they had just made the highway 4-lane. So I had more lanes to wander over as I would kind of doze a little bit. But this lady who chose to connect up with me was key in taking care of our family and keeping a home together and putting up with irregular hours and other things that I'll probably think of later. But it was very much a PhD that we got rather than I got. So when she later talked about doing a master's degree, I hesitated about a millisecond before I said, go for it, Dora.
I'll feed the cows and the
Oh, we didn't have cows then, because we lived in town. No, that would come later.
All right, okay, yeah. Well, your field work involved, that was kind of an interesting one too, I would say, just the radio tagging prairie chickens or finding nests and I guess dealing with cable chains and is that?
Nest dragging to find nest, and
How many years?
then we put a big net over the bird on the nest, and then attach radio transmitters to them, as well as shooting a cannon net over the birds on the booby ground and catch them that way. So we caught birds in two different ways.
You haven't put up a windmill out at the Pembina Trail Preserve?
Yeah, we moved in a windmill that I got donated from a farmer and had a telemetry mast on that was up about 30 feet high, something like that.
You could cable chain on the Pembina Trail Preserve at a time when we could go back and forth, and I wasn't there too much, but
yeah,
without running into the willow and the trees. But
absolutely.
It's changed a little bit out there.
It has changed a whole lot.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it was more of a diverse landscape and a more open landscape, and I was roaming that area just here the other day, and there were probably less than a dozen birds that I saw on that Pembina Trail Preserve.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe third or fourth as many as once there was.
You know, earlier today we were talking about land acquisition or whatever and preserving the prairies, and you had an interesting experience, I would have to say, in bringing on the Pembina Trail Preserve. There was, we want to talk a little bit about
Well, you must be thinking about one of the negotiation sessions. It was owned by a farmer who was not a real good manager. He, I think, bless his heart, he spent more time at the Mentor liquor store than he did tending the flock. But so we're talking about different selling prices, and he kept. First, he had heard that there was going to be, I think it was copper nickel mining out there, so he thought that was going to drive the price through the roof. And then he talked about there being spruce grouse out there. Well, it's not quite spruce grouse habitat, but bless his heart. And then he talked also about willow bucks. And that was an interesting story. And I first looked at him kind of quizzically, and he said, willow buck? Yeah, he says, they hide in those red willows, and their antlers, or their horns, he said, their horns are red, so they can hide in those antlers. But anyhow, that was a little backstory on him. They lived in a house trailer. And one night I thought we were getting closer to sealing the deal, and it wasn't like sealing a deal on the hood of a pickup like some of the deals you sealed. But so I went out there and went in, and he said, "Well, I think we should have a little nip." Well, his idea of a nip was an iced tea glass, 3/4 full of warm whiskey. And I drank a little whiskey, but never nearly that much warm whiskey. So to make a longer story shorter, the deal was not consummated that night. And I was going to run out there right quick. We lived in town still, and I was going to run out there right quick. And I think Vicki actually held supper for me. Well, I didn't make supper on time that night, but eventually the deal was made, and we wound up acquiring that tract, which turned out to be one of the hot spots for white-fringed orchids in the state of Minnesota. But the deal was for $71 an acre.
and we did a lot of fretting over that $71. That was, seemed like a,
Indeed.
yeah.
But back to that orchid, that was one of the things that helped sell an orchid, or helped sell that piece of property, because Morris Patterson was the first employee of the Nature Conservancy, and the two evaluators were walking around along with Morris and I, and they were, some of it had been plowed in the past and blah blah blah. So, but every time that we would encounter a white-fringed orchid, and it was fortuitous that we happened to be walking around out there when they were in bloom. Well, Morris Patterson would just about do a backflip at his retirement age of whatever it was, but raving about these orchids. Buy it, and he added an expletive or two along with that. So it was purchased, and
That was a Nature Conservancy acquisition, and I think it was originally about 1,400 acres or
Yeah.
something like that, and it
Right.
was one of the bigger track, so you had a big hand in that. I don't know that it would happen otherwise, but
And then
remarkable that a college crop would.
we worked out a trade for the ridge portion of that, which had been plowed and didn't have much natural vegetation left. We traded that for a portion on the south end, kind of a triangular portion plus a half section, which turned out to be the real bonanza as far as orchids. We had no idea at the time how many orchids there were there, but you know, some things just work out.
Yeah, it's been a good preserve. Yeah, it's interesting. I walked across the south end here last fall, I guess it was. And the researchers are going strong out there yet, and it's crisscrossed with lines and stakes and whatever.
And I should also pay credit to Jerry Martins, because that was early on. That was in like 72 or 73. He knew that this property was likely coming up for sale. And he got me interested in it, and I remember the sketch he made that showed the strategic location of that preserve in the middle of other preserves.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it filled in a void. So it was Jerry Martins and I that went down and talked to the board of the Nature Conservancy early on. So as well as you guys have done, made key acquisitions. And, you know, to the Johnny-come-latelys that come into the landscape, they just kind of assume, I guess, that these tracks have always been there. But people made it happen. And partnerships and maybe drinking a little warm whiskey here and there and so on to make it happen.
Well, it's been a big one. Yeah, that was a strategic piece of property to get. I remember it fit right in the middle of a lot of ours. I think Jerry Martins even had a blind on that at times, and I've taken some pictures there.
In fact, that's where his kind of classic prairie chicken photo was taken, along the eastern or western edge. And that was kind of the core area around which I did my PhD research. And there's other stories along with that, like when the neighbors whose land we were on, Frailers, didn't they didn't appreciate the fact that there was a car that had driven on their newly established alfalfa field. These were some Canadian biologists that came down to watch prairie chickens. They were in the prairie chicken blind, just the two of them. And this tractor, a bigger tractor, came steaming across the field right at them. And one of the guys says to the other one, "Dave, I think he wants something." Well, there was quite a discussion. So they knew more then about where to drive and where not to drive. And I had a little damage control to do and so on, because I had put the blind up.
It was a little different time in the early days here, and you and I spent a little time driving around and sometimes off the road and found some wet spots and whatever. But you know, it was, I don't know, we seemed to be on missions and maybe didn't always. We semi knew people who owned some of that land. And a lot of it was grazing land, and I guess we helped ourselves because the chickens needed to be counted in a lot of cases, and whatever. So yeah, so it's changed quite a bit that way, I guess. You know, although I'd say people still are very friendly, and you can, but they like to have you talk to them ahead. So yeah.
Well, you can talk to them ahead, or you can talk to them afterwards.
Either way.
Sometimes the conversation is a little bit longer. You know, if you talk to them afterwards and you're dependent upon their tractor to help get you stuck, and you're 1.5 miles away from their farm plate.
Well, you were a professor, and I don't know if I'm not sure I'm the best one to ask questions about that, but you dealt with a lot of students, I guess, over the years.
Yeah.
Can you still remember all of them? Or do you?
I
have the feeling you mostly can.
Not all of them, but a whole bunch of them. And And after a teaching career of spanning 49 years, you have a lot of experiences with students and see them develop and even when the days when we were 2-year, you still have the opportunity to have a lot of influential experiences with students, and they go on to a 4-year degree, or eventually get a master's, get PhD, or just go right into a career maybe with just a 2-year degree and very successful. But the allegiance that they had with this place where they got their 2-year degree was really strong. In many cases, much stronger than the allegiance that they would have from NDSU, say, if they go on and got a bachelor's degree there. So that was very gratifying.
Small school, big degree.
Yeah,
Seems to work.
and actually, my wife and I came up with that slogan. Largely, my wife, who as a counselor and knew the things that needed to click to attract students. And without students, you don't have college. So students is very, very important in recruitment and retention. It all works together.
A student I just talked to today here not too long ago commented on the first time she met you, came in just to maybe look at the campus and whatever, and she was duly surprised. You know, she just came to look, and she gets a letter a couple days later that was dated like the next day, and just kind of thanks for coming to see things, and any more questions, let me know, you know, or and here's my phone number and whatever, and so she was quite impressed with her.
Well, that was one thing that I did religiously with, again, usually the same day that I would visit with a prospective student. And it only takes about 6 minutes to do that.
Well, she thought you had handwritten it, so it might have taken more than, but.
No, but it still doesn't take that much time.
Very good.
And it is remembered by the students, but especially by their parents. Because if the students go and visit 4 or 5 institutions, and there's only one of them where they get a handwritten letter back, guess what? They tend to remember that.
UMC Crookston did not always have a golden eagle mascot or emblem or whatever, but I understand you may have had a hand in something there.
Well, it used to be the Trojans. And USC has used that mascot for a number of years, but it was decided that we need to change the mascot. And my friend Jim Greer had produced a golden eagle by artificial insemination. So golden eagle was kind of a cool bird. So I used a picture in my little proposal for a new mascot. I used a picture of, I think it was Ithaca, was the name of his eagle. That was part of the little write-up. And so one thing led to another, we became the golden eagles. But it is a cool bird.
Yeah.
You know, bald eagle, our national bird, they tend to eat dead stuff. Golden eagles, they kill their stuff.
Yeah, pretty good size too. Well, let's see, and you had 40-some years or more of teaching. Any idea how many students you dealt with over? I suppose it's.
Well, I don't know. It would be in the thousands.
Yeah.
Probably, you know, over that span.
What classes did you teach over those years? I suppose that evolved over time.
It did, because in the early days, because I was the first natural resources faculty, we had to invent courses and to fill the void. And I think I've taught over 15 different classes over the full spectrum. And then.
How many of those involved botany?
Well,
not so many. Huh?
Primarily the wildlife management techniques, which involve land management involving plants, plant taxonomy. I love teaching plant taxonomy, and integrated resource management, in particular involved botany, And, and I developed a course in prairie management. And a lot of that was, it involved identification of prairie plants.
Well, quite a few involved prairie, I guess, or whatever, and getting students out, and that's a good aspect of all that. Well, over the years, you've had an interest in various, and I've been slightly involved in some various research projects, I guess. One I think of as, well, actually some quite good ones. You want to talk about maybe the Burnham Creek project and Mentor Prairie?
Well, the Burnham Creek project early on was a flood control project, and I was talking with yourself and I think Ross had maybe started at that time. But just asking the question, well, with this flood control project, and it was a big one, as of course we know, it would be of value in collecting some before data that would be a reference to compare later. And so we were able to get funding from NRCS, the Red Lake Watershed District. And so it turned out to be kind of a nice study. I got an invited trip to Jackson, Mississippi to give a presentation on that because, again, there were so few of these sorts of projects early on involving wildlife to collect the before and data as a reference for afterwards data. And so that turned out to be an interesting study. We had a lot of nesting bitters on that particular track, which was kind of unusual at the time. And then, of course, the prairie chicken work, which has essentially been ongoing since 1973. And of course, you and I were very involved in establishing the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society, which celebrates its 46th meeting anniversary, which has exceeded, I think, our wildest dreams in the early days, where we might feel really tickled to have a fund balance of $350 for the whole year. And now some years involve millions in all the land acquisition and the legacy funds and so on. So that has been very fulfilling on just a lot of win-wins all the way around. And the long-term president is a graduate of UMC, got his 2-year degree here. And then the gravel pit work, that led to some demonstration kind of activities. And then got a grant to get together management information for the Mentor Prairie project, which Ross Heyer had a lot to do with, attending the auction where it went up for auction. Nature Conservancy was involved in helping to fund the study, and that resulted in kind of a management-oriented report. But students have been involved as interns, in collecting those data. So, but after you hang around the place for 49 years, things have a way of kind of accumulating.
Well, I think that Burnham Creek and Mentor Prairie both are good ones in that, it's shortly after you purchase it, you do a kind of look at what's there, and what inventory or whatever, and then something you can X number of years later follow up on that and see what's changed. And I don't know if and they were kind of designed, I think, to do this, to be that way, so probably would be time in both cases to maybe try to look at what has changed there, but.
And then the tremendous success story, and I guess a whole bunch of people had a little something to do with it, was the Glacial Ridge project, which helped to kind of tie things together and built on partnerships and turned out to be the so-called largest prairie and wetland restoration project in North America. I think it still has that title, right?
Well, you and I had a little bit it's had its ups and downs there, but speaking of negotiations or whatever, remember when we were invited to Ray Mayer, Crookston Cattle Company owned that when it was grass.
Right.
Native grass, a lot of native grass. Talk a little bit about kind of.
Well, we
That didn't go so well.
We were actually kind of duped. We were invited out to provide input, information, and were led to believe that he was really serious about protecting his prairie, and he talked very convincingly of the need to preserve native prairie and blah, blah, blah. And so we made a passionate case for just how important prairie was. Well, this turned out to strengthen his resolve in trying to drive the price up, I think, when it was all said and done, because he realized, wow, how much this meant to those, I guess they would be called greenies now, or conservation environmental types. And then, as you recall, he then started breaking it up while there was some discussion going on. He started right in the center of some of those pristine tracts in breaking it up, which had the effect of helping to break our hearts because we knew the importance of it. But again, those stinging memories remain, and it strengthens one resolve in being even more determined to keep it from happening again in quite that way. So hopefully you'll learn from
It was an expensive lesson, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of us got, so then quite a number of years later, after it had been farmed for some time, the property comes up for sale again. It's one of the largest tracts of prairie, but almost township-sized piece of land,
Yeah.
I think, like 24,000 acres or something.
And of course, the press releases at the time were, and it was a great thing that happened. But the perception of a lot of people was that, oh my gosh, they're going to restore that prairie. Now, had it been preserved when it was still in its native state, it wouldn't have drawn nearly as much attention, but it would have been many, many times better.
Yeah. But the Glacier Ridge project came about, and lots of restoration work there and whatever, and quite anyway, our second national wildlife refuge in Polk County.
Yeah.
It was a big one. So, well, I don't know if I have many more questions here, really. It's I'm pretty busy over the years, I would have to say. So I guess just the university over the years changed quite a bit from, like I said, a 2-year institution, then went to 4, and lots more programs there, it seems like, over the years.
Yeah, and it's been a dynamic place with lots of change, because it went from 2-year to 4-year. We've one of the unique things that has remained throughout is we've always had internships for all of the programs, essentially, and the work experience and the hands-on focus, which has been really critical, and so that's been a real selling point. And first campus in the world to require a laptop computer.
That's right.
By all the students, which was a very unique thing, and it kind of dragged some of us kicking and screaming into the technology age, because we had to learn how to use the computers, and I wasn't what you would call an early adopter, as some were. But,
well, your position is, well, as you said, it went from 25 to 50 or back into 75% research. That had to be a big factor maybe that kept you at Crookston, I bet, over the years too. I mean, the leeway you had for
Yeah,
research projects and various projects, and then some travel time. You work with the Wildlife Society in various ways, and
yeah, I've been fortunate to have supportive administrators, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the times, and I was able to leverage resources and influence, and became a national president of the Wildlife Society, and traveled internationally and presented papers in international wildlife management congresses, and then also another research endeavor I was very involved in was cattails. The last 5 years, maybe 6 years, using cattails as a resource, not only to control them where they had inundated marshes, but also use them as a source of biofuel. And when you get the cattail into the pellet form, they have just as much energy as wood pellets. But it's a matter of getting them out of the marsh into the pellets. And that whole process, that can be quite challenging. And more recently, I presented a paper in Germany, and that paper is in the process of being published now in an international European journal. And, but it is fun to reflect back on the different opportunities that have come along, and opportunity to work with students and do research and travel and meet people in different professions, and working with prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse, but it's just a matter of trying to figure out how much time a person has to do these various things, because I have kind of an affliction where I seem like I rarely met an opportunity that I didn't like.
we happen to be in a home that you, this used to be prairie here, or whatever, I guess, or an open piece of land, and somehow a house propped up out here.
Well, it was an alfalfa field where this house is now.
Yeah,
Originally it was prairie along the beach ridge, but there was an alfalfa field and a small grain field, and so it was a piece of rough land with lots of rocks, and which both my wife and I like, it's rocks. And so we have been restoring the prairie and built this house. I used my construction abilities to design the house along with my wife and build a lot. I would do a lot of the construction work, but overall it's been a labor of love. Have there been some challenges along the way, and building projects, one thing and another, getting stuck here and there? Yeah, but we grew up on farm, and you know, you problem solve and whatever you need to do to make things work. I mean, they just kind of come through the territory.
Well, you're out here on Booming Flats, I guess is aptly named. I would say you probably can hear booming 2 or 3 directions in the mornings.
Exactly, 3 directions, and
dancing of sharp-tails.
Dancing sharp-tails. You can't quite hear them as far, but they aren't that far away. They're just a little bit farther than the prairie chicken.
We both documented the arrival of ravens and turkeys and
yeah,
various other.
And turkeys, of course,
forms
very dramatic increases as far as I'm concerned in the last 2 or 3 years. I see 2 or 3 every time I'm out censusing prairie chickens now. Ravens are becoming more common, which is really interesting.
Not very many people would realize just probably how inviting you can be to certain forms of wildlife, but to invite a weasel into your house is probably unique, I suppose, among them.
Well, if I could add to that a little bit, you don't have to do much to invite weasels. You just have to have nice habitat and places for weasels to gain access. And at least 4 times we've had weasels here in the wintertime in the house. And in fact, one eventful evening, one actually ran across my wife and I's bed in the upstairs bedroom. And but she was reasonably accepting of that. She sleepily asked me, did a little animal just run across my arm? She had a bare arm sticking out. I said, yeah, that was a weasel. Okay, that's all she said. Okay, so she rolled over, went back to sleep, and I'm thinking, wow, you can't ask, a biologist can't ask for a more understanding wife than I have.
Well, in more recent years, you've invited bears in, and that, they
Yeah,
probably
bears
haven't gotten past the bedroom door, but I suppose they've,
Bears have become more frequent out on the prairie landscape, and they like sunflowers that are in feeders. So last spring, still in March, the feeder, pole and all, wound up halfway to the swamp. And so, yeah, that was interesting. And they really have a way of rearranging a bird feeder. I tried to salvage the little tube one because it still has bare teeth marks and canine puncture wounds in there. But the seeds did come out, those canine puncture wounds in the bird feeder. So that works too.
to be adaptable.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know too much through the university, but as far as mentors you had or leadership, there's some people that should be mentioned on that.
Oh, absolutely. Bill Marshall is key. Bernie Alquist, who was my first boss with the Research and Outreach Center, he was a very important mentor. And in a real sense, he was responsible for the natural history area coming forward as a project, because it was, except for the old gravel pit, it was scheduled to be converted back to cropland and bulldozed and so on. So he was a very important mentor. Stan Sahlstrom, the founding chancellor here, he was a very, and he was a politician, but he could, he was receptive to conservation sorts of projects. And as if we're talking about administrators and so on, one of the questions about challenging things that people have in their career. I was interim vice chancellor for 6 months one time, and a new chancellor that came in. And as I think back to the various challenges that I had, that would have to be number one.
Oh.
Because there were a lot of changes that that maybe they didn't have to be made or whatever, but anyhow, I was asked to make those, and some of which I didn't always agree with. And that was tough, especially when I tried to operate, as I always try to do, on an ethical base. And there were some decisions that were made that I was responsible for that I didn't really agree with them, but that was part of the job. So that's why I'm not academic vice chancellor, which I could have been. But I was pretty sure that I was going to be elected president of the Wildlife Society at the time, and that was much more appealing than all of the frequent interruptions that happen when you're vice chancellor, even if it may be interim.
Yeah, that's it.
So, and as Forrest Gump famously said, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
I'd have to say your dealings over the years were interesting too. I mean, I think you made it just dealing with the Natural Resources Department, the wildlife or whatever. I think we saw you at a couple of sessions at Itasca, maybe, or spring meetings in May.
Spring meeting of the BNR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And wrote a couple letters. As you and I would get to Prairie Grouse Technical Council meetings. There was a few times over the years that wildlife wasn't too sure they had money for me to go, and then you would write a letter for me, and then I was going. We usually came up with a mission that needed to be accomplished along the way there, so I appreciate that. But yeah, you probably dealt with at the St. Paul level with maybe way more than I know about, I guess, or whatever. But as far as,
Well, some things are just the right thing to do.
yeah. I think you had a good report.
That need to happen.
Yeah.
And another thing that speaking of those kinds of things, that I've gotten a lot of joy and satisfaction out of is writing support letters for people for recognition students and faculty and staff and so on. And that's I think one of the most important things that we do in life is to support others, and whether it's a little quick follow-up personal letter to a prospective student, or just a little congratulations letter or whatever. They mean a lot. The poet and philosopher Maya Angelou, who's dead now, a wonderful, wonderful person. She had many quotes, but one of them is, "People will forget what you do. They may not remember what you say, but they will never forget how you make them feel." And again, that sort of embodies the philosophy that I operate on, with trying to be grateful and supportive to others.
Well, anything you'd do differently if you had a chance?
Well, I think I would have married my wife 2 years earlier. She would have only been 15 at the time. What she said about that. But, no, it has been a wonderful journey, and I've had some times of consternation, not quite sure where the path was going to lead, but I'm very resilient. I think I get that from both my mom and dad. And problem solver, never give up. And I think I have taken strength as I look back over the years when people told me that I couldn't do something. I sort of take that as a challenge. And I remember my mother telling me early on that I was too small to play football.
Oh,
and
really?
It turned out I was all conference and honorable mention all Ozark when I finished.
At 135 pounds, huh?
No, not quite. No, I was bigger, but I was pretty darn fast, and even did a little high jumping. I didn't jump 6'6" like my son did, but anyway. Yeah, the things that drive us. Earlier today, Ross was talking about all the communications classes that he took because he felt the need of their importance. Well, I didn't take a single one because I shied away from public speaking. I had a stuttering problem into college, particularly in high school. It was kind of debilitating. And maybe that was more of a motivating thing than I realized at the time. So what did I wind up doing? Wound up being a college professor.
Teaching.
But I still remember the anxieties and the cold sweats that by having this study time.
Well, if you think of anything else we've missed, or else we need to end on maybe a fishing story or something here. You don't want to tell it, I could, but.
Well, let's see. We tested out the lack of stability of a canoe one time.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
And they aren't as stable as we thought.
No.
But we found the limits and beyond slightly.
Yeah.
Standing in the bottom of Lake Sarah wasn't as bad as we thought it was.
Right. But again, reflecting back on career conservation, I can't think of anything that I would have rather done. And the feelings of accomplishment that you get, and the sense that you've made the world a little better place, and help facilitate things for people who haven't even been born yet. And then when you hear one of your grandkids, who's now 12, say, "Grandpa, I'm going to grow up and do what you do. I'm gonna take care of your farm up there." Where he came up with that, I don't know.
It's good to have a plan there.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Yeah. Well, you got somebody to take it over. That'd be good.
Hi, I'm Dan Svedarsky. a recently retired professor from University of Minnesota at the Crookston campus. I started there in 1969 after getting a master's degree and bachelor's at the University of Missouri, and kind of a dual interest person in both plants, particularly prairie plants and wildlife. And my specialty over the years has been working with the greater prairie chicken. It was kind of a neglected species somewhat in Minnesota for many years. And over the years, I have worked as both a teacher, a researcher, and a person engaged in outreach and extension. And I've had an appointment both with the coordinate campus of the University of Minnesota at Crookston and the Twin Cities campus located at St. Paul. And that's where my research responsibilities have been. And as I mentioned, recently retired last May, and now working as some limited consulting, working as a volunteer with agencies, particularly the Nature Conservancy, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and to a lesser extent the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that kind of brings me up to the present after, as I mentioned, a long career in the classroom, commencing in 1969.
When did you begin to have an interest in the wildlife area?
That probably goes back to my childhood growing up on the farm in southern Missouri. My mother was a squirrel hunter, and so I would go out with my mother, and I would shake the leaves on the trees on the other side of the trees that the squirrels were in, that would cause them to move around so that my mother could shoot them. And we ate these squirrels because she grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia, where they ate about everything that they could grow and everything that moved. And that's where it started. And it helped to be in a rural farm environment too.
What do you think is the most significant contribution that you've made to your profession?
Well, it would be tough to narrow it down to one, but, so I'll just list some of the major things that come to mind. Probably working with students as a mentor, because I work with hundreds of students, because students then have a multiplying influence as far as wildlife and in society. And my promotion work with the Greater Prairie Chicken in Minnesota, helped organize the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society, helped in the acquisition of prairie tracts primarily, in working with the Nature Conservancy, and in doing research ranging from prairie management to gravel pit restoration, and more recently with cattails, working with colleagues from Manitoba as they work with cattails and converting them to biofuels and other uses as well. So mentoring, serving as a model, and just physically managing habitats as a member of a team or just doing it myself. Grew up as a farm boy, so I've been used to just doing stuff.
Who was the most important person that influenced your profession?
Probably my advisor on my master's program at the University of Missouri. His name was Claire Kuchera. He was the ultimate, the consummate professional and mentor, and I just learned from him, seeing him do whatever he needs to do, spend the time required to be a professional, do research. So it would have to be him. There have been others too, but that really set me on a path to make a difference. Wildlife matters to me because if you consider wildlife in the broadest of terms to include plants, and I'm as much a plant person as I am an animal person, the intricacies of life cycles and the process of growth and interactions is just so fascinating. And I'm continuing to learn of those interesting little interactions, things that I didn't know, and after over 50 years, one would think that, geez, you should kind of know it all by now. And again, that's not the case. I'm still learning. Case in point, I was duck hunting one time and I saw a spider making some little movements with its abdomen on a broken off stump around at eye height. The wind was blowing, and then this spider just took off into the air. I couldn't believe it. I had not read Charlotte's Web about spiders ballooning. I had never seen that before. And then I discovered, yeah, that's how spiders get around. Things like that. And they're pretty. And sometimes the closer you look at plants and animals, the more fascinating they become, whether it's at the macroscopic or the microscopic level.
What advice would you give to a young professional starting out in the field?
Exemplify commitment. Have integrity. At this conference, I picked up the saying, it's not who you know, but who knows you. Go to meetings. Visit with other people. Work hard. Work until the job is done, not until 4:30 comes. And that goes back to my farm boy ethic. Be nice to people, even though those who you disagree with strongly. Because there's at least one thing, if not several, that they're good at, they're passionate about, and it's what gets them out of bed in the morning. So we have to respect each other, no matter whether we agree with another person or not.
Do you have hope for the future of wildlife?
Absolutely, because without hope, you don't get out of bed in the morning. That's why people commit suicide, because you have to have hope. Now, that's not to say that you don't get down, but to not have hope means that you don't give up and things just get worse. You can be a pessimist about tomorrow, but then an optimist about the day after tomorrow. But it's being it's observing the progress and the difficulties that wildlife and habitats are having, but also making a commitment to do what you can. And one of my favorite sayings is the Serenity Prayer. I'm not particularly a religious person, and although the Serenity Prayer says, God grant me the strength to change the things I can, blah, blah, well, whatever there. But strength to change the things I can. See, how's it go? change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference, something like that. So the Serenity Prayer is something that I call up commonly. So yes, I have hope, but that doesn't mean that my faith in humanity doesn't dip from time to time, because there is so much greed and self-centeredness, lack of awareness about stability and the importance of limits. As I look out the window here, I see a wind turbine. And as I've traveled to Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and so on, you see wind turbines and other ways of sustainably producing energy. That has to be so much a part of hope and planning for the future, embracing climate change and the causes for it, that realistically, if a greater percentage of the population over time does not embrace that, then we're in tough shape as humanity, because we just have one world.
What is your favorite animal?
Well, I would have to say the greater prairie chicken, because I've spent more time studying them and making habitats better for them. But some of the African animals are pretty dang neat too. But yeah, prairie chickens.
Can you define what you think adaptive management is in your own words?
Well, adaptive management is realizing that a species of plant, or maybe an ecosystem of plants and animals, needs to be managed, needs some care. And if it's going to be based on science, you have to do the right thing. And sometimes you don't know always what that right thing is at the outset. But you know enough to know that if you don't start doing something to make the habitats better, that the species is going to go downhill fast. And there may not be time. So you do what needs to be done based on your knowledge at the time, and you start doing it. But you keep track of, by monitoring the ecosystem or the plants, to see how well it's working. And if it doesn't work, in some cases, then you tweak that, you fine-tune it. I helped design a wetland restoration project one time with the Department of Natural Resources. And the watershed which drained into this habitat area, which was over 3 hectares in size, was primarily cultivated land. So there's a lot of erosion. So we directed some of the drainage from that cultivated land into a drained wetland, hard stem bulrush wetland, that had been fed by drainage water, which was saline, which we didn't discover until later. So we directed this fresh water that was nutrient enhanced into this wetland to restore it. And in a short time, it was essentially converted to hybrid cattails, which replaced the hardstem bulrush. And we realized that we had done the wrong thing. So now it has been tweaked to keep that fresh, nutrient-enriched water from getting into the hardstem bulrush marsh, and hopefully the groundwater discharge, which is more saline, will help restore it. But again, seemed like a good idea when we first proposed it, but didn't work out that way. So there are times when you have to look in the mirror and just be honest and say, it didn't work. We got to tweak this. We got to modify it.
Can you identify the importance of the use of adaptive management to the future of the environment?
Well, in the future, adaptive management will never be as important as it is right now and in the future, because things are changing so much. There's so many influences, some of which you can anticipate, others you can't. You just have to do the best you can and be nimble.
How long have you been a member of the Wildlife Society?
Since 1966.
How do you feel your role in membership with the Wildlife Society has helped your career?
Well, I'm a past national president of the Wildlife Society, and you develop friendships internationally. It gives you a global perspective that you would not otherwise have. For example, I was the Wildlife Society's delegate to the UN Climate Change Conference in 2009 in Copenhagen, and that was really an awesome opportunity to interact with people from a broad range of disciplines from all over the world. And I presented papers and talks at 4 International Wildlife Management Congresses in Costa Rica, in Japan, New Zealand, and South Africa. But seeing other parts of the world and meeting other people who have different points of view changes your perspectives like no other, in my experience, no other way could that happen. So I've been very grateful.
Could you comment on the importance of learning different international management philosophies and perspectives of biologists from around the world?
Well, it reminds one very clearly that there's just one world that we are all dependent upon, and we've all got to take good care of it. There are definite limits, and there's no point in telling the other person at the other end of the boat that their end is sinking, because we're all in that boat. Yeah, I guess that's the big idea there.
Can you comment on the importance of using science-based management in wildlife conservation?
Well, to me, there's no alternative but to use science-based management, whether it's managing wildlife populations, whether it's building a machine, whether it's working with crops or gardening or forestry, than to base it on science, which is reality and which is truth. And to do anything other than that is, to put it simply, short-sighted and stupid. And you can't fix stupid. To quote a guy from the Blue Collar Humor shows, Ron White.
I'm almost up. Can you comment on the importance of providing students with field experience early on in their careers?
If you don't provide field experience, then it's all mental. And it doesn't get incorporated, the information, the knowledge doesn't get incorporated solidly into the brain so that a person knows what to do when they get into a real life situation. I'm a big hands-on person and firmly believe in the essentialness of that. There is a saying, I'm not sure who said it now, tell a person to do something and they forget. Show them and they may remember. Have them do it and they will never forget.
Can you provide advice on how humans can at best move forward and allow for coexistence of human and wildlife?
Say that again?
How do we best move forward and allow for the coexistence of wildlife and humans? What is your
We have to educate everyone, because oftentimes it's people who know nothing about wildlife that will exert the biggest impact on the habitats that wildlife depend upon. And we can't just do that by educating them into their head, but we have to also tap into their heart. And that's, in my view, one of the main reasons why Aldo Leopold and his writings were so effective, because he touched on science and the importance of science and wildlife management and the facts of the matter. But he also described the beauty of wildlife and ecosystems and its importance in culture in such a way that it not only reached people's heads, but also their hearts. And that's what stays with you. And if we want to educate the public, we have to tap into those things and try to instill a feeling of their importance to people, and how that wildlife can affect them or their children in some way. Because if they have no personal attachment, either directly or indirectly through their children, why should they care? And Leopold said this eloquently in the Sand County Almanac. Of what import is a dead Chinaman to us whose awareness of things Chinese is bounded by an occasional dish of chow mein? We grieve for what we know. And I think that's pretty close to exactly the way he said it. Now, growing up, my first experience to things Chinese was we'd get chow mein in the store. I had never met a Chinaman. I later did. And grew to appreciate them. I have a son now that lives in Costa Rica, so I know more about Costa Rica. So if I hear of a hurricane or an earthquake, Costa Rica, I pay attention. I have a son in his family that lives there. So how do we connect people on some kind of a personal level?